When does punishment cross the line from justice to revenge? This is a hard question at any time. It can be a challenge for parents. It can certainly be a challenge for communities, justice systems. It can be a challenge between nations. After all, we see this playing out even now between Israel and Gaza. Is it justice? Is it prevention? Is it revenge? Your interpretation of that question might dictate what you think should happen next, or what you think should be or should not be happening now. This is an old question, because when you have power, you have the power to inflict justice, but also to inflict revenge, to take revenge, and even to enjoy revenge. You see, power has a price. The price is we sometimes do more than we intend. It's that terrible euphemism, collateral damage. But we also have another challenge. And the challenge is when we look back at what's happening today, or what we have been doing, or what we've been doing for so long we can't remember why we're doing it. And we ask the question, why are we doing this anyways? Now, that can be an aspect of war and politics and conflict, but it can also be an aspect of culture. We lit Shabbat candles tonight. Why are we doing this anyways? Where did it start? Then why are we still doing it? And are we doing it for the same reason that those who created the ritual envisioned behind it? Well, we'll see all three of these themes in the Torah portion we'll be discussing tonight. That question of justice versus revenge, the price of power, and why are we doing this anyway? After all, we saw this in one of our readings in the Shabbat service, where it said that the book of Exodus claims one reason for observing Shabbat, and the book of Deuteronomy claims an entirely different reason for observing Shabbat. The Bible itself can't agree on why you should be lighting those candles, although I'll point out, the Bible itself doesn't prescribe lighting candles at all. It was the rabbis that came up with lighting candles. You see, one of our approaches to Jewish life in humanistic Judaism is to accept the concept of evolution, not just in biology and how the world developed into what it is today, but the idea of cultural evolution, that cultures were not created all at once on Mount Sinai or by Moses or at the beginning of the universe. Cultures evolve over time, they change, and sometimes they keep a ritual long after they know why it was done. I'll give you just one anecdotal example. In one family, they had a tradition whenever they made a brisket, a large pot roast, some call it, they always cut off the ends of the brisket before they would put it in the oven. But no one in the family could remember why they were doing this. And so they went back and asked older and older generations. And finally, the great-grandmother who was still around told them the truth, because they had come up with all kinds of wonderful reasons. Reasons like it symbolizes the limitations of human power, or the fact that we need to restrain ourselves when we dive into eating. It turns out the great-grandmother told them that the reason why they cut off the ends of the brisket was when they first moved to America, the baking pan was too small, and they couldn't fit the brisket in the baking pan, so they cut off the ends. Sometimes the truth is less interesting than the reasons we come up with later. Now, is the family going to stop it because they have big enough baking pans? No, they'll probably continue because it has its own emotional power to keep doing what they had been doing. So we're going to take a look at the Torah portion called bo, which means come. Often the Torah portions take their name from a word very much near the beginning of the Torah portion. Not that it has anything to do necessarily with what's happening in the Torah portion. In this case, this appears in the book of Exodus, chapter 10, verse 1, or the very beginning of chapter 10, through chapter 13, verse 16. And we'll take a look at the text in Hebrew and in English, courtesy of a wonderful resource website called Sefaria. Sefaria offers for free wonderful collections of not only original text, but also commentaries, varieties of translations, and so on. It's a great resource. And so we'll start in Exodus 10, verse 1. This is happening during the climax of the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh. You'll know this story from Passover or from the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston or Prince of Egypt or any one of the movie treatments of it. This will hopefully be less melodramatic than Charlton Heston. Moses and Aaron have come to Pharaoh. They've said, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh has refused, sometimes of his own volition, and sometimes, as it says, that his heart is hardened. Either he hardens his own heart or God is doing the hardening. We'll talk about that in a bit. And so we're into the last couple of plagues and the peak of the confrontation where Pharaoh is getting sick of Moses, Moses is getting sick of Pharaoh, Moses' demands have escalated, and Pharaoh's refusals have continued. So in some ways, of course, this raises that question at the outset. With all these plagues happening, is this justice for all the suffering the Hebrews have endured, for the cruelties of Pharaoh and the Egyptians who were the slave masters? Is this justice, or has it crossed the line from justice to revenge as you get into plague number 8 and plague number 9, and then the worst of all, plague number 10? Then Yahweh, the Hebrew God, sometimes rendered as the Lord in English translations, as Yahweh said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart." Literally, the word in Hebrew is, I've made heavy, I've made weighty his heart, and the heart of his servants, his courtiers, so that I may display my signs among them. Is Yahweh showing off? Well, partially. He's showing off about what he can do to the Egyptians, and they can't help it. But he's also showing off to the Israelites to see what he can do. And maybe by extension to the entire world for them to see what he can do. As it goes on in verse 2. Lema'an, so that you will recount in the hearing of your child and your child's child how I made a mockery of the Egyptians and how I displayed my signs among them, so that you will know that I am Yahweh. It's an object lesson. You'll see these miracles, these wonders. You'll see how much the Egyptians suffered. You will know that I'm God. You'll tell these stories to your children and your grandchildren. Notice the multi-generational command here. And that will teach them, they will know, even if they don't see a lot of evidence in their own days, that there is a God, his name is Yahweh, and look what he can do. At least what he did. Now, you'll notice something if you look carefully, because it says in this verse 3, so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. Now, notice Yahweh only talked to Moses at the beginning. And we'll see some examples where Aaron seems to pop in, even though he doesn't do very much. This gives us a clue that the people writing this story were part of the priestly editor strain of the Torah's texts. There are strains that go back even before the priests were in charge in Jewish life. And whenever the priests are in charge, they wanted to make sure Aaron, who's the ancestor of the priesthood, got his due. So they would throw in a ve'aharon, and Aaron. Even if the verb is singular sometimes, they throw in an Aaron so that Aaron's included and the priesthood is mentioned. So that gives us a clue sometimes who's doing the writing here. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so they may worship me." This has been Moses and Aaron's request, that the Israelites be allowed to go into the wilderness. They claim for only 3 days, and then they'll be worshiping Yahweh and in theory returning. Now, is this a pretext, a ruse? Well, we'll see. For if you refuse to let my people go, tomorrow I will bring locusts on your territory. This is the arbeh that we drop a drop of wine out of our cups for in empathy with the Egyptians at Passover Seder. Those locusts shall cover the surface of the land, so no one will be able to see it. They will devour the surviving remnant that was left after the hail, and they'll eat away all the trees that grow in the field. Remember, hail was an earlier plague that destroyed a lot of the crops. And so this is, round 8. Moreover, they will fill your palaces and the houses of all your courtiers, so that neither your fathers nor your fathers' fathers have seen from that day they appeared on the earth until this day. This will be an unprecedented disaster. You've never seen anything like this, unless you've lived in Illinois during the 17-year cicada hatching. Then you've seen something vaguely like this with bugs everywhere. But if you haven't, then you've never seen this before. And with that, Moses turned and left Pharaoh's presence. Didn't even wait to be dismissed. He simply marched out. The threat has been given. Now, Pharaoh's courtiers for a while have been trying to get him to listen to reason. And here they say, how long will this one be a trap to us, a snare? Let a delegation of them go worship their God. Don't you understand Egypt is lost if these disasters keep happening? So Moses and Aaron were brought back to Pharaoh. And he said, go worship your God. Who is going to go? And here's where the offer goes up. Moses replied, literally what he says, our young ones and our old ones will go. So it's everybody, regardless of social station is the translation they render here. We will go with our sons and with our daughters, with our flocks and with our herds. We will observe Yahweh's festival, his Chag, his holiday. Now, if you were Pharaoh and your group of slaves that have been restive and have caused all these disasters to come upon you came to you and said, we'd like to all go, every single one of us, with all of our flocks, would you really be inclined to give them a 3-day holiday to take everything? Probably not, because there's no love and no trust lost here. And this is what Pharaoh says. He says, well, Yahweh is with you, but the same as I mean to let your dependents go with you. Clearly, you are bent on mischief. You're trying to get away with something. No. Yes, you, the men, can go and worship, since that's what you want. And then they were kicked out of Pharaoh's presence. So now, instead of them leaving, he expels them. So here we have the threat of punishment, Pharaoh's refusal of their request, and then here comes the hammer. Then Yahweh said to Moses, hold out your arm over the land of Egypt for the locusts, so they come upon the land and eat up all the grasses, whatever the hail is left. And so Moses holds out his staff, and sure enough, here comes an east wind that blows in all the locusts. They invade all of Egypt in a thick mass. And again, notice the phrasing here in verse 14. Never before had there been so many, nor will there ever be so many again. Now, you might think this kind of an incident would make an appearance in Egyptian records. But there isn't really a clear record of either slavery in Egypt, for that matter, of the Hebrews, although there were Semitic slaves in Egypt. We do know that from archaeological records, but certainly no record of the 10 plagues or of a Moses or of any of these wonders. Of course, why would the Egyptians want to write down when they were humiliated like this? And even their gods were destroyed, according to the story, or at least humiliated. But that be that as it may, you would think this kind of a natural disaster event would have gotten some mention in their records. This is why one of the many reasons scholars suspect that this idea of the 10 plagues is really modeling more ancient Near Eastern curse formulas, where may this happen to you, and may this happen to you, and may this happen to you, rather than actually recording historical events. There have been some attempts to try to speculate how natural phenomena could have been made to look something like this, where you had, a red algae that grew that made this Nile look like blood, and then that caused the bugs to come, and then that caused the frogs to come to eat the bugs, and then the frogs died, so that caused the disease, and then that caused the cattle to get sick, and you could sort of come up with a domino sequence of plagues. But in the end, that's not the point of the story. The story is written to show the power of the God, to do things that have never been seen before, that are unprecedented, and that are unnatural. They could only happen from a God, not from any kind of natural phenomenon. That's the point of the story. these locusts came and hid all the land from you. The land was darkened. They ate all the grass, all the fruit, nothing green was left in the land of Egypt. And so now, of course, Pharaoh hurries. He hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron and says, I'm guilty. I'm guilty. I've sinned, it says in the Hebrew, chatati. I've sinned before Yahweh, your God, and before you. Forgive my offense just this once. Plead with your God that this death be removed from me. And so Moses obliges. He leaves and he relents. He pleads with Yahweh, and Yahweh causes a west wind that picks up the locust, and not a single locust remained in all the territory. Again, miraculous, right? But then what happens in verse 20? Because in theory, Pharaoh's ready to do anything. In verse 20, it says, Vayechazek Yahweh et lev paro. Yahweh stiffened, he made strong Pharaoh's heart. V'lo shilach et bnei Yisrael, and he would not send forth the Israelites. So whose fault is it here? Well, you could say it's Pharaoh for all the obstinacy he's shown in the past and for the cruelty of enslaving the Israelites in the first place. But Yahweh has a part to play too. He's hardening Pharaoh's heart. And if Pharaoh were inclined to let them go after plague 8, why not? Or plague 9? Why get to 10 other than a nice round number? Well, we'll hear Yahweh's reasoning in a bit. Then Yahweh said to Moses, after he had hardened Pharaoh's heart, hold out your arm toward the sky, that there may be darkness upon the land of Egypt, a darkness that can be touched. I love that metaphor, right? Imagine a dark, so dark, it feels like you could touch it. You know, you're like your hand is grasping for any kind of sense that's out there. Moses held out his arm toward the sky, and a thick darkness descended upon all the land of Egypt for 3 days. People could not see one another, and for 3 days no one could move about. But all the Israelites enjoyed light in their dwellings. Again, this is not a natural phenomenon. And it's clearly benefiting the Israelites, because if there's darkness everywhere and they have light, clearly there's someone on their side in a big way. So now Moses is summoned by Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, go worship Yahweh. Only leave your flocks and your herds behind. Your dependents can go with you. All your kids, your women, and children, go ahead. All the people go. Just leave the flock so I have some assurance that you'll come back. Of course, this is a slave master talking to his slaves, right? He doesn't want to lose them. And Moses said, you yourself must provide us with sacrifices and burnt offerings to offer up to our God Yahweh. And so our own livestock too will go with us. Not a hoof shall remain behind. Again, look at the imagery, right? Just not even one toe of one animal. For we must select from it for the worship of our God Yahweh. We will not know with what we are to worship until we get there. We don't know what Yahweh is going to want us to sacrifice, so we have to bring everything just in case. Again, is that believable? Yahweh's talking quite a bit. He could, in theory, give you an advance order, you know, like put in an Uber Eats request for sacrifices and it'll show up on time. But in this case, Moses is claiming that they need to bring everything with him just so that Yahweh can make a last-minute decision. It's like people that, you know, pack with 4 dresses so they can make a decision at the day of the wedding they're attending rather than simply decide before they pack. Well, that's stretching it a bit. But again, this is the prelude, or sorry, the facade that's being used to try to get the Israelites out with all their livestock as well. And again, in verse 27, Yahweh stiffened Pharaoh's heart, made it strong. He would not agree to let them go. And so now Pharaoh said to Moses, be gone from me. Take care not to see me again. For the moment you look upon my face, you will die. And Moses replied, this you have spoken correctly. I will not see your face again. That's the end of chapter 10. So the question I wanted to ask here, and ask if you have any thoughts on it, has this crossed the line from justice to revenge? If Yahweh is hardening Pharaoh's heart and causing more suffering, and hardening his heart and causing more suffering. On some level, there's a justice to some of the things that happened. The Israelites certainly suffered at the hands of the Egyptians. But has this crossed the line where it's no longer justice and it's causing suffering for the sake of suffering or for the sake of the Hebrew God showing off? Anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, who's really suffering? The Pharaoh, he can get whatever he wants, but the poor, the poor folks of Egypt, they're suffering immensely by the ramifications of all this,
Yeah.
and they have no control over the matters anyway.
Right. It's not like Pharaoh was elected or is responsive to the people. Although I would, like, we can say poor Egyptians for suffering, but they were complicit in the slavery system, like for all the sufferings the Confederacy went through. There's part of us that doesn't lament the burning of Atlanta as deeply because they had exploited, African Americans and their slaves for decades, even centuries. And so they sowed the wind and they will reap the whirlwind, as it says in Proverbs. Yeah, Rich.
The way I heard this, maybe I didn't follow it. I had the impression that Yahweh was continually turning the screws because the Pharaoh kept sort of reneging. He never was willing to give them everything, give the Jews everything what they wanted. He just kept making it worse and worse because like you say, that they didn't get everything.
So the fact that Pharaoh is saying yes, but, yes, but, yes,
Yeah.
but, Yahweh needs to turn up the heat a bit. So when
And
he's hardening Pharaoh's heart, it's to get Pharaoh to finally relent. It's almost like testing him or training him. But it's training with pain.
Well, I really he had to do that. Otherwise, the Jews wouldn't have gotten what they needed. They needed, not everybody, but they needed their stuff. On the other hand, I don't understand slaves having their own stuff, but that may be inconsistent. But they needed that to start their own land, so they needed it all. So being free, but not having their food, their flocks, would not have been effective.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, if you were a union organizer, you might take this as like, bargaining strategies, where if you're not getting what you want at the beginning, you accelerate the strike or you strike at a different point and increase the tension there, and eventually you'll get what you want. And I have to say that this is one of those Jewish stories that if you were involved in a socialist Jewish community in the 1920s, like the Workmen's Circle or the International Workers' Order, one of those schools or camps, they love this story. This is fantastic because here you've got the workers fighting against the big boss. And the big boss won't give them what they need, so the workers have to keep upping the stakes until they finally get what they need. All right.
Rabbi, does the hardening of the heart only come in towards the latter plagues, or is it from the beginning? I can't recall.
I don't think it appears as early. I think the first couple, Pharaoh's heart, I think it even says Pharaoh's heart hardened in sort of a passive voice, or Pharaoh hardened his heart, himself. But it's definitely obvious in these last chapters that Yahweh is the one doing the heart hardening,
right?
At these moments, and so then that raises this justice question that perhaps look, maybe Yahweh has a good point. Maybe the Egyptians haven't suffered enough. If he gave the plague of blood at number 1, and Pharaoh said, "Okay, fine, you can all go. You're done." Is that really going to teach the Egyptians anything?
Right. They don't learn anything.
Right. Let alone teach the Israelites anything. So
right.
This is where we have to sort of, parse this out. And look, I'll make the connection explicit. We see what's happening between Israel and Gaza right now. And, if Israel had, dropped a couple of bombs on October 8th and then said, "Okay, we're done," that wouldn't have satisfied anybody, and it wouldn't have changed the reality on the ground. Part of what they're trying to do in Gaza, however, heavy-handedly at times, is trying to change the reality on the ground that led to what happened on October 7th. But the question is that's being debated on the streets and in social media is whether their attempts to change that reality are causing too much damage to the other side that there's no possibility of moving forward, or will simply lead to the next round of Hamas Part 2 or the sequel, and also are not being effective for meeting the goal they want, and certainly not a question of justice. And there are certainly voices in Israel that are calling for explicit revenge to what happened on the October 7th. So this is why I thought this Torah portion in particular might be valuable to dive into. All right, we're going to continue on to chapter 11, not the bankruptcy law, but Exodus chapter 11. And here we'll begin to hear a little bit more about that second idea, the price of power and collateral damage. So in chapter 11, Yahweh says to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh in Egypt, and after that he'll let you go. Yahweh even knows that it's going to work. When he lets you go, he'll drive you out of here, one and all of you. Tell the people to borrow, each man from his neighbor, each woman from hers, objects of silver and gold. Now, this is really the Huckleberry Finn version of borrowing. Remember how Huckleberry Finn borrows a watermelon from somebody? This is the Israelites borrowing gold and silver from their neighbors to flee. Now, if you were an anti-Semite and you wanted to read this passage to talk about the avarice of Jews, you could certainly do that. In fact, I remember a case maybe 20 years ago where someone from Egypt filed a lawsuit against Israel demanding repayment for these gold and silver objects that were taken. Of course, then a countersuit was filed by someone in Israel asking for 400 years of back wages for the slavery that took place before the taking of the gold and silver. So you can argue fictional narratives both ways. Now, Yahweh disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and Moses was much esteemed. So we assume that these objects were, in fact, lent. Now, what happens next, this is a little confusing, because remember before, Pharaoh had said, leave, never see me again, and Moses says, you're right, I'll never see you again. But now, Moses is talking, and he's talking to Pharaoh again, as we'll see. So, either these next few verses are sort of an aside. By the way, Yahweh whispered in Moses' ear, or he had previously told Moses, or, it's sort of a step aside from the moment, because the end of verse 29 could jump right into verse 4, because Moses is responding to Pharaoh, as we'll see in the dialogue. Moses says, thus says Yahweh, towards midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every firstborn, it's assumed to be male because the form is male, every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle, because those cows really had it coming. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as never been or never will ever be seen again. And you hear that this is a one-time miraculous phenomenon. First of all, how could you get an illness that only hits the firstborn? Impossible. And every firstborn of the Egyptians, from Pharaoh on the throne, who now it's going to hit home. Whatever Pharaoh could have dodged with any of the other plagues, no escaping this one. And every firstborn of the Egyptians, from the top to the bottom, and even the cattle, but only the firstborn of the cattle. This has never been and will never be seen again. That's, again, that miraculous claim. Not a dog will snarl or bark at any of the Israelites, at human or beast, in order that you may know that Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Remember that idea of the chosen people? The idea that there is this God of the universe who has chosen one people for special attention, special punishments at times, but certainly special rewards and special regard and special intervention. This is what's happening. This is the special intervention for the Israelites. As it says earlier in Exodus, God remembered them in their slavery. So whatever he was doing the intervening 400 years, now he's on the job, and the Israelites are going to get this special protection from this last plague hitting Egypt. And then after this happens and this firstborn dies, remember this is Moses filling in Pharaoh and what's going to happen. And then all these courtiers, all these servants of yours will come down to me and bow low, saying, depart, all you and all the people who follow you, and after that I will leave. And he left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. So Moses is at the end of his rope. He's done. Now Yahweh had previewed to Moses previously, Pharaoh will not listen to you, in order that my marvels may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Again, why is Pharaoh not listening? Why does Yahweh know Pharaoh doesn't listen? Why does Yahweh harden the heart? To multiply his wonders in the land of Egypt, to show off, to show how powerful he is. I'll give you an example of this from 20th century history. After the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the Japanese began contacting the Russians to try to sue for peace. And we knew this because we had broken the Japanese codes. Why did we then drop the second bomb on Nagasaki? We dropped the second bomb, at least in part, to show the Russians that it wasn't a fluke, that we could do this again. And so even if Hiroshima could somehow be justified comparing it to the casualties that would have been incurred by invading the Japanese home islands, given what happened in Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the theory was that in the long run it saved lives to drop that bomb. It's debatable. But the Nagasaki bomb was showing the power of the Americans and their technological military might, not to the Japanese who were already asking for peace, but to the Russians, to the Soviet Union, so they would know that we are Yahweh, well, or that we are the preeminent power in the world. And so in some ways, it's even less defensible. Moses and Aaron had performed all these wonders, all these marvels before Pharaoh, but Yahweh had stiffened the heart of Pharaoh so he would not let the Israelites go from his land. And so now, here we have a shift in the story. It's going to step away from the Moses, Aaron, Pharaoh confrontation for a moment, and it's going to start to provide that third theme I mentioned. Why are we still doing this anyways? It's going to provide reasons for certain ritual practices that the Hebrews do. Some of them are connected to what happens to firstborn. Some of them are connected to harvests. Some of them are connected to animals. But we'll see this is the dawning of Israelite ritual and civilization if you accept the history. Or, if you think about it as an evolution, this is a new reason for something people were already doing, but now connected to this new story. So we pick it up in chapter 12. Yahweh says to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month will mark the beginning of the months. It's the first of the months of the year for you. We're starting a new calendar. It's one of the ways gods and kings establish their power is they declare a new calendar. Speak to the community leadership of Israel and say on the 10th of this month, each of them takes a lamb to each family. If the household's too small for a lamb, then they share it with their neighbor, proportion to the number of persons, but you want to make sure you have a lamb that covers everybody. Your lamb is without blemish, from a year old. You could also take it from the sheep or from the goat, so it doesn't have to be a lamb, but one of your flock. And you watch over it until the 14th day to make sure it's without blemish, right? You don't get it nicked up or anything. And all the assembled congregation at twilight, Bein Ha'arbaim, which is just as the sun is starting to go down, the very end of a Jewish day. Remember, the Jewish calendar begins at night with all of its holidays. So we're on the 14th of this month. And at the very end of the 14th, which is just about sundown, that's when you slaughter it at twilight. They will take some of the blood and put it on the two mezuzot, the doorposts. By the way, that's a sort of secret in Jewish life. We think the mezuzah is the marker on the doorpost, but actually the word mezuzah means doorpost. And then on the lintel, the crossbar at the top. So you take the blood, put it on the two side posts and on top of the door where they're going to be eating the lamb. They eat the flesh the same night. They eat it roasted with fire And how do they eat it? Umatzot umerorim yochluhu, with matzah, unleavened bread, and with merorim or maror, they'll eat it. So notice, we who are used to celebrating Passover Seder's, they're eating the Passover sacrifice of the lamb or sheep or goat with matzah and maror. So going back even to this early story, that's part of the ritual. You're not allowed to eat it raw, no lamb sushi or whatever the equivalent would be. And it cannot be cooked in any way with water, not boiled. It has to be roasted, the whole animal together over the fire. You do not leave any of it until morning. If any of it's left, you burn it. So you sit and eat and eat all night, this animal sacrifice, once you put the blood on the doorposts, and then whatever's left over, you burn up, which is a way of giving the meat to the god by sending it up. And this is how you will eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, a staff in your hand, and you eat it hurriedly. It is a Pesach, a Passover offering to Yahweh. And here's why you do all this, especially the blood. For that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human and beast. I will mete out punishments. This is the claim, punishments, or in Hebrew, shvatim, judgments, to all the gods of Egypt. Now, this does raise the question. I thought this Bible was monotheistic. Well, maybe it's what is called henotheistic. There's one God that's stronger than all the other gods, but maybe there are other gods, because here he's talking about judging the gods of Egypt. Now, you could say that's proving them false. Okay, but it's much more satisfying if he defeats them, right? That's like a win for the Israelites, where if they weren't gods at all, then what's he achieving? So this is, again, part of that evolution of Jewish thought that maybe at one time Jews did believe in other gods. They just wanted their God to be more important than the other gods. It's only later in the evolution of Jewish thought that the other gods got fired or were demons or something else, demoted to demons. But Yahweh gets promoted to the only God. And so now why the blood? The blood on the houses where you are staying will be a sign for you. Interesting. Does that mean a sign to remind you or a sign on your behalf? When I see the blood, remember this is Yahweh talking. When I see the blood, I will pasach, I will pass over you so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So, by the way, for the darkness, flip a switch, Israelites get light. For the Nile being turned to blood, Israelites get water. But for the angel of death, or for Yahweh himself going around slaughtering firstborns, here's the test. Will you follow the commandment? Will you put the blood on the door? So just as they're trying to train Pharaoh, here Yahweh is trying to train the Israelites. Follow the rules on pain of death. I could do it all for you, as I did for the other plagues. But this one you've got to do for yourself. Now, it's also, lucky signs and talismans and totems and taboos that are being enacted here. But it's also part of that training process for the Israelites. And this day, says Yahweh, that 14th to the 15th, shall be to you as one of remembrance. It'll be a zikaron, a memorial day. And you will celebrate it as a festival to Yahweh throughout the ages. Celebrate it as an institution for all time. 7 days you will eat unleavened bread. Here's the matzah. Remember eating the animal with the matzah? 7 days you will eat matzahs. And on the very first day you remove all the leavening from your house. For whoever eats leavened bread on the first day, there's the seventh day, that person is cut off from Israel. You are no longer part of the group. You celebrate a sacred occasion on the first day, a sacred occasion on the seventh day. So you could do a Seder on the seventh day, by the way. Some families do. They do it on the first night and the seventh night instead of the first and second night. No work is done on those, only what you have to eat, that alone is prepared. You will observe this Chag HaMatzot, this festival of matzah, for on this day I brought your ranks out of the land of Egypt. You will observe this day throughout the ages as an institution for all time. So notice, the idea of observing 7 days of matzah is described as an institution for all time. But so too was putting the blood on the doorposts, right? Celebrate that as an institution for all time. So maybe at the time this was written, people were eating matzah for 7 days, and they were slaughtering animals and putting the blood of that animal on their doorposts. Now, that would make sense in the differing professions of the Hebrews, because they were either generally farmers that raised grain of some kind, or they were shepherds that had animals of some kind, right? The sheep, the goat. They could use those rules for either profession, either the blood on the doorpost for the shepherds or the matzot, the unleavened bread, for the farmers. But notice both of those are proclaimed as institutions for all times. Thank goodness we only do the matzah, if we choose to do that, and don't have to put blood on our doorpost anymore. And so you have to not only take the leaven out of your house, you have to not eat anything leavened for 7 days. Whoever is eating what is leavened, that person, notice this line in verse 19, whether a stranger or a citizen of the country shall be cut off from the community of Israel. Nothing leavened to be eaten by anybody in all of your settlements. So the idea of a separation of religion and state, or the private sphere where you can choose what you want to practice, not part of this worldview. Even the stranger living among you has to follow the rules of purging all leavening from their home if they want to live. This is being cut off from the community is, a sentence of cosmic death, just like happened to the firstborn. So now this is what Yahweh has told Moses and Aaron. Yahweh doesn't speak directly to the people. This is Yahweh talking to Moses. So now Moses has to convey this to the people. And when Moses conveys it to the people, sometimes it's a little bit different than what Yahweh says. Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said, pick out the lambs and slaughter the Pesach, the Passover offering. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood, and apply that blood to the lintel and the doorposts, the mezuzot. No one go outside the door of your house until morning, just to be safe. When Yahweh is going through to smite the Egyptians and sees the blood on the lintel and the mezuzot, on the doorposts, he will pasach, he will pass over the door and not let the destroyer, the mashchit, the slaughterer, enter and smite your home. So here, the initial version was Yahweh said, I'm going to go through and do it. Now he's delegated it to someone called the destroyer. And then notice what Moses says, again, about the blood, the lintel, the doorpost. You will observe this as an institution for all time, you and your descendants. And when you enter the land Yahweh will give you, you will observe this rite. And then here's the part that reminds us so much of Passover. It's the, why are we doing this anyway? When your children ask you, when they see you put the blood on your doorpost, as was just described, when your children ask you, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem? What do you mean by this ritual? This is one of the exact questions that the 4 sons ask during the Passover Haggadah. This exact question. Not about the blood, it doesn't clarify that there. In the Haggadah, it has one of the sons asking that question with those 4 words in Hebrew. And you'll see other questions from those 4 sons show up there. These aren't the 4 questions of the Passover Haggadah, but these are the 4 sons and the questions that they ask. When your child asks you, what do you mean by this? You will say, this is the Pasach, this is the Passover offering, the Pesach, actually Zevach Pesach, this sacrifice of Passover to Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when smiting the Egyptians, but saved our houses. So this is the object lesson. When you see us put it on the door, it's to remind you of the power of Yahweh as demonstrated by this last plague in Egypt. And so the Israelites went out and did just as Moses had and Aaron had been commanded. And now in verse 29, in the middle of the night, Yahweh struck down all the male firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on his throne to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And Pharaoh arose in the night with all his servants and all the Egyptians. There was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no home in which there was not someone dead. This is a cataclysm that affects everyone. And so Pharaoh knows why this happened. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, "Up, depart from my people, you and the Israelites with you. Go, worship Yahweh as you said. Take your flocks and your herds as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing on me too. Get all your stuff and get out of here. Enough. Done." Notice that Moses had said to Pharaoh, "You'll never see me again." He does see him again, but Moses doesn't have to say anything again. So maybe what Moses meant was, "You'll never hear from me again because I won't have to say a word." Even the Egyptians urged them on. They wanted to hurry them out of the country. "Get out of here before we all die." And so the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. This is the origin story for the matzah, right? But didn't they mention matzah in the chapter before? Well, maybe there are a couple different stories for why eat matzah. Maybe because it's the spring, you cleaning out the old wheat, that's why you get rid of the leavening, and you bake the older fashioned bread that was not leavened before we learned how to do that. Maybe you do it as a harvest festival, just like you've got the Passover offering for the shepherds, you've got this matzah festival for the farmers in the spring. Or maybe there's this story in verse 34 following, where the people took their dough, they were too rushed, they just threw it on their backs. My father's family, his family was from Syria, they actually would take matzah and put it on their shoulders as part of the Passover Seder experience to remember this verse in the Exodus story. Now the Israelites had done Moses' bidding and borrowed from the Egyptians silver and gold and clothing, which wasn't even mentioned before, right? They added on the clothes. And Yahweh had disposed the Egyptians favorably and let them have their request, and thus they despoiled, they stripped the Egyptians. The Israelites journeyed about 600,000 fighting men on foot, aside from the non-combatants, and also a mixed multitude, an Erev Rav, went up with them, which is, who knows, other people they were connected to. There are examples we know of non-Jews who had married Jews who were part of this community. They show up later in the Exodus narrative. So for those who advocate for a more open and inclusive Jewish community, this passage that even in the Exodus, there was this mixed multitude that came out with them can point back to stories like this, or the fact that Moses married a Midianite, or that Joseph married an Egyptian priestess. There are other stories of intermarriage, even in the Torah. So this is one of those places people that want the more inclusive Jewish community today will point to argue that that's always been the case in Jewish life. And of course, all their livestock. That was the whole point. And now, verse 39, we get this origin story for the matzah. They baked unleavened bread, unleavened cakes of the dough they had taken out of Egypt because it was not leavened. The ugat matzot, the cake of matzah, of unleavened bread. And they could not delay, and they had not prepared any provisions for themselves. So it bakes fast, doesn't rise. And of course, this is an origin story for matzah, the Exodus narrative, even though it was mentioned the chapter before in observing the Pesach. And so in theory, if they observed the Pesach the way God commanded, they ate unleavened bread before they made unleavened bread. Right? That first Pesach where they killed the lamb, roasted it, had the blood in the doorpost, and ate it with matzah and maror, they did it before this origin story for the matzah. But there are legends about, the Maccabees playing with dreidels, which talked about the future miracle of the Maccabees. So, historicity is not necessarily all in order in mythological narrative. The Israelites had been in Egypt for 430 years, and then they managed to escape at that night, a night of a vigil throughout the ages. And again, more laws about the Passover offering. No foreigner can eat from it, but a householder's purchased male slave can eat once he's been circumcised. No one uncircumcised can have it. So it's, again, an in-group claim. You have to eat it in one house. Do not take it outside of the house. All of Israel will offer it. If a male stranger who lives with you wants to offer the Pesach, all his males must be circumcised, and then he can do so. There is one law. Again, that idea of separation of church and state doesn't exist. In this case, no temple and state separation. One law for the citizen and the stranger who dwells among you. And they were freed by Egypt. And then in chapter 13, Yahweh adds some laws. Consecrate every male firstborn, human and beast, The first issue of every womb, that what's called a Peter Rechem, the first pregnancy that results in a living result, what opens the womb, that is mine. It belongs to Yahweh. So why the firstborn belongs to Yahweh? Remember what was the last plague. Moses said to the people, remember this day on which you went free from Egypt, the house of bondage, which I freed you with a mighty hand. Do not eat leavened bread. You go free this day in the month of Aviv. Aviv means spring. So maybe the season of Aviv. But that's why Passover is today, even today, in the spring. Although notice, it said this is the first month of your calendar. It's not the first month in the current Jewish calendar. What in the Bible is the 7th month, when you blow the ram's horn and you do Day of Atonement, in the rabbinic calendar, that became the first month, when they made Rosh Hashanah. So when Yahweh brings you into the land, a land flowing with milk and honey, you will observe this practice. So repeating the commandment about the leavened bread. 7 days you eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day a festival to Yahweh. Again, through 7 days, no leaven found in all of your territories. And V'higadata levincha, you will tell the story to your child. That word higadata is almost like the word Haggadah, right? You can hear the word to tell a story right in there. You explain to your child on that day, it is because of what Yahweh did for me that I went free from Egypt. This is the answer in the Haggadah to the child that can't even ask a question, who's so simple he can't ask anything. So here's the answer that shows up in the Haggadah directly coming out of Exodus. And this will serve as a sign on your hand, a reminder on your forehead, just like the tefillin people wrap. This is another one. So the teaching of Yahweh, the Torah Yahweh. Remember, Torah can mean teaching, not just the written book. With a mighty hand he freed you. You'll keep this institution of the matzah from time, set time from year to year. And when Yahweh has brought you to the land of the Canaanites, you set apart the first issue of every womb, every male firstling. But every firstling ass or donkey you redeem with a sheep, because they're sterile, so they're not allowed to be sacrificed. You have to replace it with something else. And you redeem every male firstborn among your children. And when in time to come, a child of yours asks you, Mazot, what is this? This is another question of the 4 sons. And here is the answer that's given as well in the Haggadah. It was with a mighty hand that Yahweh brought us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. So we have questions from the children about the blood. We have questions from the children about the matzah. And we have questions from the children about the firstborn redemption. It might be a firstborn child, by the way, that could ask, who do I belong to here? If you're reading this passage, don't worry. Children are redeemed. They don't belong to Yahweh the way the animals do. When Pharaoh refused to let us go, Yahweh slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt of human and beast. Therefore, I sacrifice to Yahweh every male issue of the womb and redeem every male firstborn among my children. And this will be a sign on your hand and your symbol on your forehead that with a mighty hand, Yahweh freed us from Egypt. It is an object lesson in the power of Yahweh, collateral damage to the Egyptian slaves and servants and children and cattle be damned. That's a very hard Torah portion. But I can imagine it isn't hard for some people to read, because they have no problem with the suffering of the enemy. They have no humanitarian compassion for the oppressor. The oppressed peoples can do no wrong, according to some. And so whatever it takes by any means necessary, they can gain their freedom, even if it is at the casualty of the firstborn of the cattle and even the firstborn of Egypt. You see, there's an anti-humanism on both extremes in our current moment. On one hand, there are those who say that any suffering Israel has received is deserved because of all the oppression they have enacted on Palestinians. That's anti-humanist. There are others who say that whatever suffering the Gazans, the Palestinians, are receiving is justified because of the depredations enacted on Israel by Hamas on October 7th, and in previous incursions and ongoing rocket fire and all the rest. But that too is anti-humanist, to say that any collateral damage enacted to show Israel's power to the Palestinians, to the Lebanese, to the Syrians, to the Iranians, After all, one of the reasons they're pounding Gaza into dust is to show Lebanon, this will happen to you if you don't stop. That too is anti-humanist, because it's saying that your suffering and your death is a necessary collateral damage to my goal. And so we who are humanistic and Jewish, we have conflicting allegiances here. We find ourselves in the middle, wanting justice, wanting violence to be productive if possible, for the long run to end without violence, not wanting to cross to revenge, even if it's a temptation in our heart. We do not want our hearts to harden, because then we become Pharaoh. Any last thoughts, comments, or questions about this Torah portion in Exodus 10 to 13, the portion Bo, which means come? You can hear Yahweh saying, come to me at any cost. Yes, Bill.
I was just thinking, if it was all-knowing God, why did he have to go through 10 things when he knew that the first 9 weren't going to work? He should have just went to 10 and started from there.
Well, that's one reading of it. I mean, you could say that, you know, teachers sometimes have to teach people by steps. And you have to undermine their beliefs in, you know, one step at a time, or you have to judge this God and judge that God. So maybe there's a God of the Nile, so you cause it to turn to blood. And there's a God of the cattle, so you cause that God to die. And, you know, you're sort of working your way off the checklist. So the Egyptians gradually learn, or so that the Hebrews learn. Remember, the goal is also to teach the Hebrews who's in charge here. And
How big a committee was needed to write this whole segment?
Well, look, again, this is where that you have that question about vengeance. You know, the Jews who are writing this in Judea, probably in the 600s, maybe the 700s BCE, Egypt is one of their major antagonists. So they have no qualms about reading a story that shows Egypt suffering. I mean, one of our dilemmas today, you know, the U.S. Army firebombed Tokyo, killed 100,000 people. They firebombed Dresden, killed tens of thousands of people. We had very little sympathy for the Japs and the Bosch and whatever else we called them. Today, we have a little bit more sympathy for the suffering of the enemy. And when you see those pictures from Gaza that look like Berlin in 1945, or Tokyo for that matter, we feel in ways that we didn't feel 80 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. The authors of this story did not lose a tear for the Egyptian suffering. We, at least in the rabbinic era, at least took a drop of wine out of our glass for each of those plagues. It's a small, you know, penance for what otherwise is celebratory, but it's a step. And so maybe today our sympathies for the enemy are a little bit higher, and we don't revel in the suffering of our enemies in the same way.
Just a quick question / notice. You sort of frame this as justice versus revenge, but as you were sort of going through it, there was also an element of narcissism / aggrandizement of God himself. So it's sort of like that's another element of the story, which feeds into, you know, the all-knowing God, if you
Right.
believe that. But that sort of supersedes the justice versus revenge. It's sort of like, yeah, I can do whatever I want with you, including toy with you, even if you are predisposed to change your mind.
Right. Right. Well, that's sort of a third layer. Is it justice? Is it revenge? Or is it just, you know, using a people?
Don't like the camera.
Or is it just using a people as an object lesson, you know, for other
Right.
people to see? And then that could be even worse. Sandra, please.
Why does it mention folks who've just left slavery having their own slaves? There was one section in there. That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, one of the tricky parts is the word for slave in Hebrew is eved, which also means servant. So in theory, there could be a hierarchy in a household where you've got, a head slave and a subordinate slave. And also remember, there are many models of slavery that are not the same as American slavery, right? The kind of chattel slavery that we had was one style, but not the only style. And even in chattel slavery, slaves could earn money. They could have their own animals and livestock. They sometimes worked to earn their own freedom and bought their own freedom because they had earned money to do so. So the idea of slaves having livestock or slaves even having their own servants is certainly plausible. Believe it or not, there were even African Americans living in Charleston before the Civil War who themselves were freed and owned slaves themselves, because if you had the assets, you would do that. So slavery is a very complicated institution, and there are many ways to do slavery. In the model that's described here, evidently they could have some property or some animals they claimed as their own, and perhaps even some servants of their own. Yeah, Lori.
I just wanted to add to that because actually the kind of chattel slavery that we see after the 15th century, in the 16th century in the the New Hemisphere, is actually unusual. What we have in earlier times are families of people who are considered to be a slave is a bad term for it, because what they really are more like tenants. They're not selling off family members.
Like a servant class.
Yeah, it's a servant class, and they had their own families, and they sometimes they lived on their own lands, but they owed labor. It's think more like serfs, really, in Russia than in the sense of what we think of as slavery. I did want to just make one small correction. Yes, there were some blacks in the South that owned slaves, and outside of New Orleans, where you had the Creole class, but usually they were family members that they were buying out, so they weren't really, they weren't like acting like whites in that sense.
Right.
It was really rather a different thing.
Any last thoughts, comments, questions?
It's time to go down.
This is one of those moments where we're looking at the skeletons in our own closet. This doesn't make us proud to be Jewish, to see that this attitude, this rhetoric appears in our literature. But this is part of the human heart and the human experience. And so even if we were never slaves in Egypt, even if we never enacted this revenge, this justice, this demonstration on the bodies of the Egyptian slaves and their firstborn and their cattle, even if it never happened, the impulse is part of the human experience. The dark corners of the human heart are reflected in this story. And so we are not honest to ourselves if we don't look in those dark corners and learn something about what we are all capable of doing. This has been one of the hardest things for people to realize coming out of a Holocaust or an October 7th or any other tragedy of human depravity. It's human depravity. They're not animals, they are people, and so are we. And so we have to deal with those hard sides of human nature.